Hello everyone, Ace here, and today, well, we're gonna have to talk about that extra credits video yet again. As it turns out, it seems I was actually mistaken about one detail in their video. Now, if you haven't already seen them, I have provided links in the description below to both the original extra credits video as well as my first reaction video, and I highly recommend at least watching one of those videos for the proper context here. So anyways, do you remember in the original extra credits video when one of the solutions that extra credits posed was to actually add the option to switch teams while in-game? You know, a feature that's been in FPS games since time immemorial, including with regards to the Battlefield franchise specifically? Well, as it turns out, a viewer of my previous video has actually pointed out that EA and DICE decided to do something extra different with Battlefield 5, and so have added to their list of boneheaded moves by actually removing the option to switch teams in Battlefield 5, supposedly to fix problems with people switching to the winning team later on in the match. So yeah, as it turns out, technically speaking, myself as well as other people who have commented and criticized extra credits video, such as Arch Warhammer, were actually incorrect and wrong in assuming that Battlefield 5 allowed players to switch teams. I will however say in my defense that this has been a feature that has been a staple of the FPS genre for a very, very long time, and it was quite simply beyond my comprehension that EA would actually manage to stoop to those kinds of depths. And considering we're talking about EA, that really says something about just how boneheaded and incompetent a decision it must have been to remove the option to switch teams in a multiplayer FPS. Fortunately though, this does not keep extra credits from being absolutely wrong in their assessment in that train wreck of a video they made. And this also provides an excellent opportunity to discuss a few things that I actually glossed over in my previous video, so let's have a look at those now. For a start, do you remember in the original extra credits video when they made the absolutely absurd and arbitrary requirement that the game would actually have to go out of its way to explain to the player why the character in question is not a Nazi in a multiplayer match? Well, as utterly ridiculous and extreme a requirement that actually is, DICE has actually managed to pull that one off, technically speaking. This is because the elite character known as Wilhelm Franke in Battlefield 5, which I mentioned in my previous video, actually by sheer accident and coincidence shares the exact same name as a resistance fighter that fought against the Nazis during World War II, which caused yet another controversy for Battlefield 5, which resulted in DICE having to actually go out and explain in detail that Wilhelm Franke is not actually a Nazi. So yes, as amazing as it sounds, the most extreme demand that extra credits made is something that DICE actually already did as well. But moving on from that, I'm actually going to go into the real meat and potatoes of this particular video, as I'm now going to be addressing a comment from another YouTuber who also watched the video, and their concerns that I actually needed to go into further detail to explain why extra credits' argument that having characters that represent extremist ideologies in a multiplayer game somehow normalizes those said ideologies, and why that argument is utter nonsense. For a start, it's essentially the same as the argument that violent video games cause violence, which was perpetuated by people like Jack Thompson back in the day. At their very core, both of these arguments are built upon the idea that merely having these things in a video game will cause them to be replicated in real life in increasing frequency. So to suggest that they are essentially the exact same argument is not really much of an understatement. It is very close to the truth. All we're doing is swapping out violence for political ideology or extremism. Now, when it comes to Jack Thompson's argument specifically, that has been debunked time and time again. You can actually go on and find quite a few articles and studies that show that violent video games do not lead to an increase in violence. In fact, despite the increasing prevalence of violent video games, violent crime, in particular in the US, has been on the decline for quite a while now. Now, unfortunately, by comparison, the debate of politics in video games is a far more recent one, which means that studies are going to be fewer and far in between. Further complicating the matter is the fact that most of the academic sources that actually study or discuss politics in video games are actually from the gender studies side of the academic community, which means that they're going to have a very real and clear bias. Take, for example, one of the foundational works that actually influences the politics in video games debate, specifically Games of Empire: Global Capitalism in Video Games, which despite being an academic source was actually written by very clear die-hard communists, who, judging by their work in this book, were actually far more concerned with making a political statement than they were with doing actual honest research. I actually mentioned this particular book as well as some of its problems when I made a reaction video earlier to Jim Sterling when he decided to talk about politics in games. Rather than completely re-record what I said then, I'm just going to simply repeat the clip here now. Let's start off by looking at Games of Empire: Global Capitalism and Video Games by Nick Dyer Witheford and Greg D. Peyoter. This is a work that you'll see quite commonly sourced when it comes to academic studies regarding politics within video games. And yet, if you happen to be an actual video gamer that happens to stumble across this work, you'd realize rather quickly that it's filled with nonsense and gibberish. For one very good example of what exactly I'm talking about, this paper even goes so far as to suggest that World of Warcraft is in fact pro-capitalist propaganda, specifically because it relies on an economic system that is based off of the free market, when by contrast, historical medieval societies relied more on bartering systems. First of all, let's ignore the two very obvious discrepancies that this author is making. The first being, of course, that World of Warcraft is a fictional fantasy setting. A fictional setting that has comparatively higher quality weapons and armor that are widely available in comparison to the historical medieval setting, suggesting far greater economic development. And the other obvious issue is the fact that the player is not taking on the role of a peasant farmer or anything at all like that, and is instead taking on a job where money would be more readily available. Ignoring both of those very obvious discrepancies that neither of these college professors ever noticed is the fact that World of Warcraft itself is based on the Warcraft franchise in general, which prior was an RTS franchise that utilized a command economy that was run from the top down and was the exact antithesis of a market economy. You would think that two college professors would be able to actually catch a discrepancy like that if they were doing serious research on video games. But that is sadly not the case, and instead they argue that World of Warcraft is pro-capitalist propaganda. And the extension to that argument is, of course, that Blizzard itself must be pro-capitalist because they are putting pro-capitalist propaganda in their game. At least that's the argument that's being made. But of course, in case you're curious, let's demonstrate how faulty that argument is when we compare it to other games in the Warcraft franchise, and while we're at it, compare it to other Blizzard games as well. So using the rules laid out by the arguments made by these professors, Jim, we can determine that they apparently believed that Blizzard was communist when they developed Warcraft 1 and 2, but converted to capitalism when they developed Diablo, but then converted back to communism when they developed StarCraft, but then converted back to capitalism when they developed Diablo 2, but then converted back to communism when they developed Warcraft 3, but then converted back to capitalism when they developed World of Warcraft. Do you see how utterly unhinged and deranged this argument actually is, Jim? And yet, this is one of the most foundational works when talking about politics within video games. This is the sort of nonsense that you are arguing in favor of, Jim. As you can see, Games of Empire is such an extreme work that it actually suggests that merely having an economic system featured within a game makes that game a propaganda piece for the said economic system. And in this way, it is actually quite similar to the argument that Extra Credits makes when it suggests that merely having particular imagery within Battlefield 5, and having this imagery be, in their own eyes at least, little more than window dressing, is itself making a political statement, if unintentionally, or at the very least is making those said ideologies appear less abhorrent. It's important to note for comparison's sake that the authors behind Games of Empire were diehard communists, which means that they viewed the capitalist economic system as being abhorrent in their own way as well, which is why they viewed merely having a particular economic system within a video game as in and of itself propaganda. So even though there aren't exactly many studies out there when it comes to the politics in video games debate, I have still managed to demonstrate that the moral busybodies that want their particular politics in video games, and anything they disagree with removed, are still utterly unhinged and operating on a foundation that is, at its very core, fundamentally flawed. And I do hope that this finally brings a valid explanation for those who are wanting one, on why Extra Credits' argument was actually itself flawed, rather than me just picking apart the examples they were trying so desperately hard to use. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.